It wasn't long before she was focusing her attention on derivatives in the yard signs when the Graham had ruled that they didn't constitute futures. The business had exploded. Sumitomo, a large Japanese commodities dealer, had been caught using over-the-counter derivatives as part of an effort to corner the copper market. The product and gambling in Orange County, the, the blazes were still fresh on people's minds after she had been in officer for a while, but also began to hear rumors that firms were using Swap the Doctor their quarterly financial statements. As she looked more closely, she realized there was some question as to whether the grounds for the gram exceptions still applied. After all, it was only supposed to pertain to one of the keen debates between sophisticated counterparties, yet swap had become so commonplace that many of them were practically standardized and used of this self-contract language. If derivatives were become standardized, born whether shouldn't they also be traded on Ether exchanges? Wouldn't they be classified as future and should they be regulated? Although the Sumimoto market manipulation case had been exposed before she took office, the agency conducted its investigation and imposed a hefty fine on Burns. Watch the experience made her realize that we were treating the police a very rapidly grow part of the market for manipulation and fraud, but we knew nothing about the market. She later said there were no record keeping requirements to reporting requirements. It was totally opaque. Byrne was in many ways a political knave. She ran an agency with fewer than 600 employees. She lacked both the power based and the political skills to say members of Congress or her fellows regulators of the new was that derivatives were a gigantic market and that someone bad things had happened in the past and that meant it had likelihood that bad things might very well happen in the future, and no one in the government had a clue. Born and others and the FCFTC started carrying their bets, the hippopotamus under the rank. About a year into her tenure, Bourne hired atop Washington Legator Michael Gremberger to be the director of the CFTC's Division of Trading and Markets, which made him one of her top debuts. The hearing itself suggests what a thing her she had for politics. Gremberger had never been involved in commodities and so had no natural allies on the agriculture communities that oversaw the CFTC. He and Byrne had gotten to know each other serving on the board of an agency that helped the Omelets, but he was the he had spent his career involved in complex litigation and had argued several cases before the Supreme Court. Like his new boss, he also knew how to be taught when he needed to be, not coming out of the community's industry. He later said gave, eh, gave him an advantage over just about anyone else who might have taken that job because I was not dependent of the futures business. I really did not care what the futures industry thought of me. Not long after he came on board, Greenberger had a meeting with Byrne. I remember her telling me that we have a lot of things to do, but that I had to start focusing on over the counter derivatives. He says thus in began that Bob Robin worried about derivatives was not the result of some conversation experience that took place after he joined the government. He had felt the same way during his year of the fixed income desk at Goldman Sachs. It's not that he hadn't traded in derivatives, what was an opposition after all but a kind of derivatives, or that he didn't understand their value as a handed derivatives, but he had always had a healthy fear of them because he understood better than most that in a crisis, their combination of exercise, leverage, and counterparty exposure could make them an immensely destructive force. I remember both Goldman in the 1980s size former college. He was always the guy saying, I am not sure how much principal rights we shall be taking with the derivatives book. When it got to be a $1 million book, the trader wanted $2 billion. Bob would agree reluctantly. By the time Bob left, it was probably in $10 billion or um, billion book, but Bob was always worried. His fear stemmed from something almost no one else in government could claim actual experience with derivatives meltdown down in happening in the late 1980 when a sudden, unexpected shift in interest rates, unforeseen by Goldman's Sachs models, needless to say, wreaked havoc on the bond and derivatives markets. Bonds and derivatives products began to move in unexpected way relative to each other because traders hadn't focused on these securities might be hacked under the extremely unlucky market conditions that were not occurring. Robin writes in his memoir, neither Steve nor I was an expert in this area, so her confusion was not surprising. Um, but the people who traded this instrument did not fully understand the develops either, and that was sadly. You'd come to work thinking we we lost a lot of money, but the worst is finally behind us. Now what to do we do? And then a new problem will develop we didn't know how to stop the process. He concludes what happened to us represent a seeming tendency in human nature not to give appropriate weight to what might occur under remote but potentially very demanding circumstances. Once he got to Washington, Robin found himself surrounded by people who viewed it with lack of enthusiasm for derivatives as a amusing eccentricity. Most of the young tongues he brought with him to treasure were one who about derivatives. His core group of young assistant secretaries, including a 37 years old treasure Wonder King, named Timothy Gaynor, approved of derivatives. Larry Summers was said to tell Robin that his attitude about derivatives was a little like a tennis player who wanted to keep using wooden rackets when everyone else had moved to grab it. And of course, there was Greenspan, whose enthusiasm for derivatives knew no bounds during the derivatives battles in the mid 1990s. Dozens of officials from the Fed and Treasury, including Greenspan, testified in favor of unregulated derivatives and argued that the best thing the government could do was stay out of the way. Despite his qualms about derivatives, Robin never once cites anything published to contradict the Clinton administration party line. Oddly enough, it was the SEC that sent the first shot across the globe in December in 1997. It proposed that the investment bank it supervised both their derivatives business in a separate unit and resized them vocabulary with the agency under this plan. Derivatives dealers will have capital requirements, but they will be lower than the preferred firms, and they will have to use risk models to calculate the risks of their derivatives book, but they could use their own internal bar. In fact, the derivatives transactions themselves wouldn't even be regulated by the SEC. The plan was called Broker Dealer Light. When the SEC put its plan out for public comment, Greenberger quickly drafted the response, writing that the SEC proposal raised serious jurisdiction issues. The CFTC argument that if any agency should be rights be overseeing derivatives, it should be the CFTC. Burnwell later cited that she didn't care who wound up regulation derivatives so long as it was done right. The sex little approach highly qualified. The she then instructed Remacher to draft a policy paper. The draft he came up with, 33 pages long, was called a concept release. It asked market participants and others a series of open-ended questions aimed at re-examining the agency. Should buyers in the swap markets be requirement to report their positions to the government? Should swap be sold through a central clearing facility? Should the CFTC impose capital requirements of derivatives transactions? Should derivatives dealers be made to conform to certain internal control standards? on soon. The draft of the concept release was complete in March 1998. As an independent regulator, Bird had the right to simply publish it and leave the world wrecked, but he didn't do, do that, viewing himself as someone who wanted to collaborate with other regulators. She sent it around to all the other important actors, not just the other regulators, by lobbyist, gay legislator of the Treasury Department to solicit their feedback. Feedback, blowback was more like it. One day I will get into Broxley office, said Greenbacker. She put down the phone and all the blood was drained from her face. She sighed. That was Larry Summers. He had been screaming at her. Summers had told her that he had just been visited by a group of bankers who said that if the CFTC insisted on pursuing their conceptualize, they would move their derivatives business to London. Summers wanted us to stop, says Greenberger had burned. There was so much pressure. The derivatives dealer did not want this market locked at at all. For some of them, derivatives trading make up percent of their profits. A month later, the president working group met to discuss Burns conceptualize the PWG and its wallet consistent of regulators, the chairs on the FIT, the SEC, and the FTC, plus the Treasury Secretary. But this had become such a hot button issue in Washington that virtually anti-bank regulators were there. Larry Summers, John Hawkey, the comptroller of the currency, Helen Seidman, the director of the Office of Thrift Supervision, William M.C. Donoghue, the president of the New York Fed. It was a very tense meeting. There recalls one person who was there. The date was April 21 in 1998. The purpose of the meeting, and quickly became clear, was the persuade Byrne to back off. Then other regulators made all the old arguments about the dangers of classifying derivatives as futures. Byrne, for her part, he thought CFTC was a long way from trying to regulate derivatives. All it was trying to do ask some useful question and glean some useful answer. Rampants thought even asking the question was dangerous, recalls Byrne. And where was Robin? Given his story of concern about derivatives, you might have expected him to be Burns when Aldi in the room during the Asian financial crisis. Robin had asked one of his aides to find out much derivatives exposure. You say financial institutions had to South Korea. We couldn't find out. This is regal. Robin was stunned, but in this meeting,